All right, so just a quick reflection. The bell rings, and the teacher says, "Today we'll talk about plant growth and reproduction." The teacher then tells the students how plants grow. No notes are put on the board, no visual aids are used, and students are not involved in discussion. The teacher talks in a monotone and rambles considerably. It is impossible to tell when the teacher goes from one topic to another. Now, think about it. Have you ever been in a class similar to this situation? If you were a student who is in this situation, how well would you learn? And what are some fundamental principles of learning that this teacher is failing to use? And so, obviously, a situation like that's not very conducive to learning. And if you think back to our previous lesson on effective teaching, um, we know that they are violating a lot of Rosenstein and First characteristics of effective teachers. Um, and so it's really not a very good learning situation. Now, so with that being said, we learned about characteristics of effective teachers as defined by Rosenstein and First. We're actually going to look at some principles of teaching and learning now. And so some things that are just very basic to the nature of teaching and for people to learn. All right, so our objectives then are explain the principles of teaching and learning that are basic to optimizing learning outcomes and apply the principles of teaching and learning to classroom, laboratory, and supervised practice. All right, so terms, principle, fundamental law or truth, scientific law that explains an action. So it is something that's very fundamental, something that is very basic, um, even backed by science. So it explains what happens. Um, so that is a principle. A psychological principle, then, it explains how humans behave or act. So psychological principles explain how humans behave or act. So it's a fundamental explanation to these psychological processes of how a human behaves or acts or what they do. Um, and so, what we're going to be talking about are really some psychological principles of teaching and learning. All right, so the first principle of teaching and learning then is subject matter must possess meaning, organization, and structure. Think back to characteristics of effective teachers. The most effective teachers are ones who are task oriented and business like behaviors. And so they organize and have structure and they provide meaning to what they're teaching. All right, so students are going to learn more when they understand the meaning behind what it is. So, is it relevant now or will it be relevant in the future? What are some real life examples? How will it relate to careers or focus on career, industry problems, issues? And then they will use action titles for their lessons. So um, you're not going to do swine nutrition. You do feeding the sow and litter, or you're not going to do principles of landscape design. You do landscaping a residential site. So it's not just a title of what it is, but what will you be able to do with this? And so, parliamentary procedure. No, we're conducting, participating in meetings. So we're not going to learn program procedure. We're going to learn how to conduct and participate in the meetings. And so use action titles for your lessons to explain what it is or the reality of what it is that you are trying to teach. And you want to sequence content for logic and understanding. So it should go in a coherent sequence that makes just perfect sense for the content, and you build on foundational knowledge to more extreme knowledge. So that you want to sequence that content. You want to use prepared instructional calendars, communicate objectives, review and closure, and clarity of assignments. All of that is going to go back into um, having structure and organization and meaning. So make sure that your students know their objectives for the lesson, review and close at the end of the lesson, and then provide clarity for assignments as much as possible. All right, so the second principle is readiness or prerequisite for learning. All right, so you want to begin at learners or participants level. So you don't want to start if uh, if you're teaching math and a student doesn't know algebra, but you're teaching calculus, you can't teach them calculus. They're gonna have to know some basic algebra to move on to those higher levels of math. Um, and so always start at that student's level. Determine prior knowledge in the subject first before you begin, so you know where to start, and then account for individual differences, backgrounds, and abilities as best as you can. And then, based on readiness level, reorganize your content. So, get to know your students. You have to know what it is that they know, what their interests are, what their aspirations are, their experiences. And then how do you know if learners are ready or not? Based on their interest, enthusiasm, how they act. That's really the best way you can know about their readiness. All right, the third principle then, students must be motivated to learn. We've talked a lot about motivation in this course, and I've said this principle multiple times, but it is a very important principle. If students aren't motivated to learn, they're not going to. So think about what motivates you to learn. Is there incentive or reason for learning? Subject matter must have meaning again, and then instructor's enthusiasm can help motivate. And then active versus passive learning. Usually, active learning is going to be more of a motivation to learn because they're going to be more involved with the learning than just sitting back and listening, which is more passive. So we want to be active and up and involved with the learning. Activities that encourage curiosity, creativeness, competition, and ownership are all good for that active learning. You want to use learners' ideas as much as possible, so let them contribute during discussion. Repeat or rephrase learner comments so that you can provide clarity and then make sure that other students heard and understand what was being said. And then try to apply those learners' ideas in any way that you can. Um, the more that you can apply their ideas into what you're teaching, the more engaged they're going to be. All right, so principle number 4. Students will rise to the level of expectation. This is probably my favorite principle of teaching and learning, and I believe it to be completely true. High expectations yield high results. Your expectations should be challenging but attainable, and the instructors must stand fast with their rules and expectations. Students will look for and exploit loopholes. They will try to um, exploit those loopholes, get around what you're trying to do or what your expectations are. But if you'll stick to those expectations, I guarantee you, if you'll set challenging but attainable expectations, every student in your class will rise to that level of expectation. Some will do it almost immediately, and then you'll have others. It may take a whole year for them to finally get there, but they will rise to your level of expectation eventually. You just have to stick to that level of expectation. All right, and so principle number 5, success is a motivating force. Think about anytime you've had success in something. Once you've been successful, even just at a minor level, then you tend to want to continue to do it. And so success early or simple to complex is really a good way to get students excited or motivated to learn. And so find little wins in the beginning to help push them along to more complex ideas. So ensure activities for success as possible. You don't want to give them an activity or an assignment where they can't be successful, because if they can't be successful, they're not going to want to continue to do it or do anything in your course. So success must be evident and recognized. But once we do have that little taste of success, we are generally hooked and will continue to try to be successful in that area. All right, so number 6, knowledge of progress. It's human nature to have feedback and know where we're at. So you need to give feedback as often as possible. Use questioning during instruction. Use labs to observe and diagnose. Communicate correct and incorrect. So let people know or let your students know when they got something right or when they got something wrong. And then provide feedback during activities. So that directed study right when they're doing it, give them feedback, and then as much written communication on assignments as you can provide to give students an idea of what that progress is. All right, so principle number 7, reinforced behaviors are more likely to be learned. This is behaviorism. So principle number 7 of teaching and learning is basically just the idea of behaviorism. When we reinforce behaviors or reward good behaviors, they're gonna learn more likely to learn. So reinforcement must be viewed as a reward, clearly connected to behavior, and immediately as possible following the behavior. So when you're trying to reward that good behavior, you don't wait a few days; you do it immediately, so that it is associated with that behavior. Negative relationship between criticism and achievement. So you don't want to criticize anything during achievement because of that negative relationship, and then caution accepting mediocre and inferior work. If you accept mediocre or inferior work, it can be deemed as, well, that was good enough, and so that's all I have to do in the future. Um, and so it's behaviorism at work. You just rewarded them for doing that mediocre, inferior work, and they think that is good enough. And that goes back to the other principle of level of expectation. If you will hold that level of expectation up and only reward them when they meet that expectation, then these principles start to play together in that aspect. Directed learning versus undirected learning. Instructors must direct, lead, and guide. Make sure learners know expectations. So be upfront with them. Tell them what the directions are, what your expectations are, what you want them to do. Don't leave anything out. Be as detailed as possible, because if you just say go do, they may or may not do things like you want them to, and may or may not learn as much as you were hoping they would. So you'll need to supervise activities in direct laboratories and keep learners on task as best as possible. Now, sometimes undirected learning is good, but if you're trying to cover content and get students to learn as much as possible, then yeah, you want to have more directed learning. Principle number 9: inquire into versus being instructed in. So this is the active versus passive learning. You want to have a variety of instruction materials and methods. We already talked about variability as being a characteristic of effective teaching. So have a variety of instruction materials. Use problem solving, decision making, and use different cognitive levels of question. We're going to talk about cognitive levels of questions in the next lesson on Bloom's taxonomy. But active learning is always better than passive learning, having them up and involved in doing activities, inquiring into, so letting them have inquiry, asking questions, discovering things is better than being instructed. So it's better than me just telling you about the information that I want you to learn. All right, and then number 10, students learn what they practice and apply. So if you want them to really learn something, let them get in there and get their hands on it and actually practice it, do it, and apply it in different situations. So in class, laboratory, community, and work. It becomes meaningful and realistic when they can apply it and it resembles actual situations. So they deal with real problems and decisions. However, that practice must be supervised and feedback must be provided to make sure that they are learning it correctly. That is the 10 principles of teaching and learning. You need to have a pretty good idea of what all 10 of these are and how they relate to teaching and learning. You might want to know that number 4, the level of expectation, that's my favorite principle of learning, and then you might want to know which one is related to the behaviorism. So keep that in mind. But that is the principles of teaching and learning.